The year was 1974, and my good friend Russ needed help. Specifically, he needed my help. He was in a bind. Now, Russ and I went to the same church together. We went to the same Sunday school class. We knew a lot of Bible verses, and one of the Bible verses that always stuck in my mind is, "No greater love has a man than he lays down his life for his friends." My friend needed my help, and so I was willing to help. Russ needed to get to a VD clinic. Now, if you weren't around in the 1970s, you might not know what that is. VD stands for venereal disease. Venereal disease covers all the different ones, syphilis, gonorrhea, everything else, and we would call them sexually transmitted diseases today. He needed to go to a VD clinic, and his parents would not let him drive the car, nor would they drive him to the VD clinic. Now, before you think ill of his parents, you need to understand that Russ was a virgin. He had never had sex before. There's no way he could have a sexually transmitted disease. But Russ was the editor of the school newspaper, and he knew that there were people in our high school that needed to know what happened in a VD clinic. And so he wanted to go and pretend that he had a sexually transmitted disease and go through all the tests and find out what it was like and then write an expose in the school newspaper. But his parents thought this was the dumbest idea that they'd ever heard, and they said, "You are not using the car to drive to the VD clinic." Well, about that time, my parents were going away for the weekend, and foolishly, they decided to leave me as a 17-year-old and my 14-year-old brother alone. And my dad looked me square in the eye and he said, "That car that we're leaving in the garage has to remain in the garage. Unless there's an urgent emergency, you do not drive that car. Do you understand?" "Yes, Dad, I understand." Well, Russ told me his story about wanting to get to the VD clinic, and I thought, well, this certainly sounds like an emergency to me. So I went and picked him up, and we drove. Now, you have to understand, too, he didn't want to run into anybody that he might know, and we came from a very large high school, so we decided we had to go to the next county. So this was quite a distance away, and we went to the VD clinic. He went inside. It seemed like forever that he was in there. It was probably about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, and he came out, and he was just white as a sheet. I said, "What did they do to you in there?" He said, "Oh, you don't even want to know." But I did know because he came home and wrote about it for the school newspaper. But as we're driving back home, I said to him, "My God, Russ, what if my dad wrote down the odometer reading on the car before he left, and he's going to come back, and he's going to check the odometer, and he's going to see that we drove about 75 or 80 miles. What are we going to do?" He said, "Well, do you know anything about rolling back an odometer?" I said, "No, I don't know anything about that." And he said, "Well, maybe we could try and do that." So we get back to his house. Now, you have to understand, too, this is 15 years before Ferris Bueller's Day Off was produced. And if you ever saw that movie, they roll back the odometer, but they were smart in that movie. They put the car up on blocks, and they, ran it in reverse and everything. And we came up with the dumbest idea ever, which is to take apart the dashboard and try and pry the numbers back again. Okay, so here we are. We pull into his driveway. We get out all these screwdrivers, and back in these cars in the 60s and 70s, you could actually see the screws and everything. So we take apart the dashboard, and we carefully label everything and make diagrams, what screw goes where. And we're doing all of this, and suddenly Russ's dad pulls up, coming home from work. Well, he's been off flying. He flew for United Airlines, long-haul flights. He comes home dead tired. He's walking up the driveway. He sees all this stuff all over the driveway. He said, "What are you guys doing?" "Well, we're trying to roll back the odometer." He said, "Well, you can't do that." And he walks into the house. And Russ and I looked at each other, and I said, "Come on, Russ, we're almost there. We got to at least try this." So we took off the last few screws, and suddenly there were the numerals of the odometer, naked. We could get to them. I took the screwdriver, and I started to try and push them back, and they weren't moving. The more I pushed, the harder they pushed back, and I said to Russ, we're done. We're not going to be able to do this. So we put the whole dashboard back together again. We were able to do it, no screws left over. looked good. We got back home. My parents arrived Sunday afternoon. I was on pins and needles. What are they going to say? Oh, my dad drove the car around. He never said a word. I thought, I'm home free. This is great. He never even noticed. He trusted me. About a week later, I'm driving with my dad. It's a beautiful spring night. We have the windows down. We're talking. We're almost home. Suddenly, there's this huge noise behind the dashboard. My dad looks down to see the odometer fall back behind the dashboard. And the speedometer is going from 0 to 120 back to 0. Back. It's just flipping around, and it's making a horrible noise because there's a cable back there, and it's just making this horrible noise as the odometer is flipping around somewhere back in the dashboard. I thought, this is unbelievable. What am I going to do now? So we got home, and my dad said, I have never seen anything like this happen before in a car. I can't imagine how this could have happened. I said, yeah, me either, Dad. I said, why don't you let me take the dashboard apart and see if I can do something with it? He said, what are you going to do? I said, well, I don't know, but, let me give it a try. He said, well, it can't hurt anything. So, of course, I knew exactly how to take the dashboard apart, so I took it all apart, and I was able to take needle-nose pliers and get back in there and get the odometer and pull it up enough that I could wedge it somehow so that it wouldn't flip around. And we drove the car, and it didn't do that anymore. Of course, we never had use of the odometer again, but the speedometer worked okay, so that's not bad, So now this was an old car, even in 1974. My dad didn't get rid of that car until 1985. By that time, I had gone to college, I'd gone to seminary, I had married my wife Karen, who's here, we'd had our first child, and finally, after 19 years, this car dies. My dad has it towed out of the driveway. I've never told him what happened to the odometer. So we're sitting there at Thanksgiving, and I said, Dad, I have a little story to tell you. And I told him about the odometer. He said, I knew something was fishy about that. I knew that odometers don't just do that. I knew something had to have happened. I just didn't know what it was. And I said, I did it, Dad. It was my fault. And he actually was kind of hurt. I could tell he was kind of sad. And I don't know if it was because I had damaged his car that he loved so much that he kept all those years, or whether it was because, as his son, I had been deceptive and hadn't fessed up to what was really going on. But that story is one of his favorite stories today. And at age 86, he still asks me to tell the VD clinic story. And so I do, as I'm doing here tonight. And I return to the verse that I started with. Greater love hath no person that they lay down their life and their odometer for their friends. Thank you.